Alright guys, so things aren't going well for the US semiconductor war. Biden has thrown the entire kitchen sink on China. He has curbed critical chip exports to Chinese companies. But there is a hidden cost to this madness. China can always retaliate, and they did. Beijing is blocking the use of Intel and AMD chips in government computers, and this ban might start with state-owned firms. However, it's going to extend throughout the country sooner or later. We cannot overstate how critical Chinese demand is for Western chip companies. Why do you think Intel is in big trouble? Why do you think the billions in the CHIPS Act aren't working? Because you're cutting away high profit revenue from China. In 2023, China accounted for 27% of Intel's total sales, and that's their largest market by far. For AMD, 15% of sales comes from China, and that's extremely significant. And it seems every single month the chip war just gets progressively worse. This is going to be the end game of the chip war, to starve China completely away from semiconductor technology. And to accomplish that, the US needs to recruit their Western allies to join them. But we are beginning to see an epic pushback. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the Dutch are saying no. They are fighting back against Washington. The economy minister of the Netherlands gave the US a big warning and tore up Joe Biden's plan of chip domination. We are still going to sell our chip machines to China. Listen to the rebuke here. It applies to every country in the world. Even Japan might one day follow this playbook. The Chinese are an important trade partner, and we have our own economy to upkeep. ASML is a crown jewel for the Netherlands. It's important that the company can operate as freely as possible. This is one big slap to the face of the US. The Dutch are rejecting America's semiconductor war. They aren't buying what Raimondo is selling.
We have to get smarter about what are the technologies, which are just where we are ahead of China. They're capable of doing very bad things, and we're going to deny the entire country this class of equipment. Is industry on board? I mean, yes, but they're in the business of making money. Every time I take an action, it denies them revenue. My own view is that industry, newsflash, democracy is good for your businesses. Rule of law here and around the world is good for your businesses. So it might make for a tough quarterly shareholder call, but in the long run, it's worth you working with us to defend our country's national security.
If you're ASML, you can't let the US walk all over you. It might be high-tech chip makers today, it could be servicing the machines tomorrow, but down the line, it will be everything else. At the end of the day, when it all comes down to brass tacks, it's about business and revenue. In 2024, half of ASML's business comes from China. At least one in every two of their chip makers are sold to Beijing. And that's a lot of flip-flopping from the Dutch. Even though they are a US ally, cutting Beijing away will destroy the company. The semiconductor business is a very expensive one. Salaries are very high, and the amount of power needed to make the machines is insane, it's enormous. But there's also one expense companies can't ignore, and that is research and development. For ASML, they have to pour a ton of money into R&D. It's essentially for them to keep innovating to build better machines that can make better chips. Last year alone, ASML invested nearly 4 billion euros into research and development, and that is over 14% of total net sales. It's a really simple equation here. If half of their entire sales, which is from China, disappears, where is the money for R&D going to come from? Their servicing revenues will also collapse, and so will their budget for research. Will the US send ASML $4 billion in compensation to punish China? These are the big questions that the company and the Netherlands themselves have to ask. How far will we bend over to protect US hegemony? There's a limit to how far Raimondo can push her chip sanctions. As the Dutch minister said, ASML is the crown jewel of the Netherlands. If the company collapses, they won't have another brand on that scale. ASML is the largest Dutch company by market cap, worth over $260 billion. It's one of the world's top 50 companies and Europe's only entry in the technology sector. They are as important as TSMC and Samsung. Cutting away Chinese revenues will cripple the company. They won't be able to afford their R&D costs, and sooner or later, they will get displaced by US competitors. Companies like Lam Research could one day overtake them down the road if their revenue completely dries up. And this next part is hilarious. You'll realize how ridiculous US demands really are. It's literally your smallest client telling you to get rid of your biggest customer. And these are the numbers talking. Despite the tech curbs, China is still ASML's biggest market. In Q2, China drove $2.3 billion in revenue. The US, a tiny 140 million euros in sales. In other words, China's revenue is 16 times higher than sales to the US. This is objective reality. If ASML stops selling to China, their entire business will collapse. There will be a ton of layoffs and outreach in the Netherlands. So, will the Dutch really drink from the poison chalice? So far, we have been talking about the West, but let's not forget China has their own tech sector as well. They have a ton of money and a big army of engineers to throw at the problem. Philip Wong, the chief scientist at TSMC, admits that China will catch up. Their level of research is already world class and rising even further.
Today, China and Asia, the papers are more than 40%, almost close to 50%.
Oh my gosh.
And the US has steadily declined from 40, 50% to 30 to 40%. And the rest of the world, principally Europe and Japan, has basically fallen off the cliff. So the research and development, the research capability in Asian countries, China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and so on, have really become the strongest region in terms of producing good quality research. I'm not just talking about quantity, just quality.
Coming from Philip, it really paints the picture of the situation. Yes, you can try to contain China, you might delay them for years or even a decade, but sooner or later, Chinese tech will catch up. It's important to understand the big disparity in STEM graduates between the West and China. They have both the quality and the quantity of brain power within the industry. In 2020, China produced nearly 3.6 million STEM graduates, of which over 40% are working in STEM fields. This is astounding compared to the G7 countries combined. The US, for example, produces only 820,000 graduates in STEM, but only 20% of them work in STEM fields. So there's this big disparity of available talent and the work pool. If we filter down to the raw numbers, it's simply crazy. In just 1 year, China produced 1.4 million new graduates working in STEM. That's almost 10 times more than 160 grand in the US. So how do you reconcile that gap? It's quite impossible. Chinese universities like Tsinghua, they're at the top of the world rankings. It's basically on par with MIT, but based in China. This presents a very unique problem for ASML. Eventually, China will catch up. They will innovate and build their own machines. If that's the case, selling them our tech might actually dampen down their urgency to innovate, and at the same time, we earn more revenue. US scientist Steve Su once again confirms this. China is already starting to innovate and they are moving really, really fast.
So if you talk to people who are really in the semiconductor industry, either in Taiwan or in China, they realize like, oh, this was a big mistake. They're catching up super fast. It may still take them years to completely catch up. And there are certain things like the lithography machines, EUV, extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that only ASML makes. Those will probably be the last things that local Chinese companies are able to produce. There's a tons of speculation online among technical people about whether it's going to be a couple years before there's a comparable Chinese EUV lithography machine, or will it be 5 years, or will it be more? So nobody really knows exactly what's happening. People in China know because, some rumors are they're already testing prototypes and things like this. So that is in a microcosm, maybe the most dramatic change in a particular ecosystem, and this is a very big ecosystem because, China imports more microchips than it imports oil every year, right? Or it used to.
It's better for the West to work with China instead of forcing them to the corner. And this is something ASML and Tokyo Electron in Japan, they have to realize. If you follow US sanctions, you get clobbered twice. Firstly, your revenues will collapse to hell. Your bottom line will be in Hades, the underworld. Secondly, you just force China to innovate harder. You light a fire under them and make them run even faster. What's the point of doing that? There's almost no strategic gain at all. You are playing checkers when you should be playing chess. China is claiming their chipmaking gear has made an advancement. Now, of course, any news from anywhere has to be taken with a grain of salt. But if this is true, it means they're starting to solve their biggest bottleneck in semiconductors. And let's focus on China's real agenda, their endgame here. State-linked organizations are advised to use a new laser-based immersion lithography machine. It has a resolution of 65 nanometers or better. 65 nanometers is hardly a breakthrough on the world stage. ASML's DUV machines can operate at less than 40 nanometers. The smaller the resolution, the better. But notice the language. China is telling companies linked to the state to use their local machines. This is the big play here. The moment Beijing bridges the technology gap, it's game over. Chinese semiconductor demand will be met by local companies. And if China can make their own advanced chips, they will use the same playbook in their EV industry. They will use their deep supply chains, affordable energy, and a gigantic mountain of subsidies. The semiconductor war is one big resource battle, and Chinese companies are spending a fortune on R&D. In 2023, the EU conducted a study on semiconductor research investments. Huawei tops the list with over 20 billion euros invested in a single year. That's more money than Intel and AMD put together. It's also 5 times more than the budget of ASML. The scale of Huawei's investments is simply incredible. And their R&D intensity is near the top at 25.2%, which means over a quarter of their sales revenue is diverted back to research and development. But here's the real threat to Western chip makers. China is the biggest consumer of semiconductors, which means more revenue will be given to local Chinese firms over time, especially so when the G7 trade war is ramping up. And this gives China's tech progress a very exponential quality to it. It might take 5 or 10 years to catch up, but once they do, Chinese companies will dominate the landscape. Sure, the G7 can definitely protect their markets. They can put tariffs on anything Chinese 100%, 200%, 1000%, whatever. But the biggest market for chips, which is BRICS, will be buying semiconductors designed and made in China. And that is the end game China wants. But let me know what you think. Will the Dutch really punish China? And can Beijing catch up in a semiconductor war? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.